our session. If you are, it looks like everyone is named according to who they are, which is great. We are going to, in a minute, I'm going to hand it over to our speaker, Dr. Andi Thacker. And then after she speaks, we'll have some time for question and answer with her. And we'll take all of this off recording, and there will be the opportunity to join a breakout group if you would like to do that, or we can discuss the material that was presented tonight and kind of see how it applies to us and to our family. So I welcome you to stay for that. And then after our breakout groups will come together again, just for brief announcements, and then a benediction and a go forth. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Andi Thacker, who will be speaking with us, and we'll get you spotlit.
All right. Thanks, Liz. Thanks for having me here with you guys tonight. It is one of the things, even though this has been such a difficult time and a troubling time, I'm so grateful that we have the technology we have, because if this had happened 10 or 15 years ago, we wouldn't be able to meet in the way we are able to meet now. So it's just such a gift that we can gather, even if it is virtually. So I'm going to go quickly because I want to make sure you guys get plenty of time in your breakout session. So what is grief? Grief, in a nutshell, is the emotional response to anything that you've lost that was meaningful to you. And sometimes we don't know that what we lost was as meaningful as it actually was until we're faced with the emotional response to that loss. And sometimes we don't know the depth of that loss until we walk a little bit in life, or we have experiences like this pandemic that reveals different aspects of the loss that we've experienced. So a couple of things that are important to know about grief: you don't just get over it. Unfortunately, I've listed in your resource section a couple of podcasts. One is one that I got to do with some colleagues down at the seminary, and it's about grief, and there's some great resources in it about what grief looks like and how you progress through that process. But you don't just get over it. It's something that we walk through. One of my colleagues, Bill Hendricks, calls it entering the house of mourning. And when you enter the house of mourning, you don't really ever leave. It's kind of your new home, but it doesn't mean that the deep anguish remains forever. It just changes in form and in function. So as we progress through life, that loss, whatever it is, changes. And I think right now what we're experiencing, and I would imagine for many of you that have a loved one that has special needs or differences, that the pandemic is revealing different aspects of that loss in different ways that are unique to your experience. And so you may have really progressed to a different point in your loss grief journey with having a loved one that has differences, but now with the pandemic, your experience is so different than others because maybe there's a medical frailty or something that just interferes with your ability to connect with other people and to face this new normal, maybe like other people are. So I would imagine that the pandemic has brought up different aspects of your loss and probably new opportunities for grief that you didn't realize were there beforehand. So there's a great article, and some of you may have had access to this or seen it. It's by a journalist named Tara Hale, and she's talking about this concept of surge capacity. And surge capacity is this thing that when we enter into a disaster or a traumatic experience, our bodies will naturally rally and they'll kick in and they'll do whatever they need to do to be okay. It's kind of that adrenaline response that if you've had something happen, a natural disaster, a car accident, something like that, your adrenaline just spikes and you have a lot of capacity to get a lot done. So that's what happened to all of us when we went into the pandemic. The thing about surge capacity is it depletes over a period of time, and it was never meant to be something that we stayed in for a long, prolonged period. And that's what's unique about the experience that we're in right now, is that we have depleted surge capacity reservoirs but we still have a need for this surge capacity. And so many people are running on empty. And we are looking at what researchers call ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is an aspect of grief and loss that is just, there's no clarity around it and there's no resolution. So if you've had, and I'm going to just guess that everyone that's joined with us tonight has had the experience of having a loved one who has special needs, and so you've had an ambiguous loss. That would qualify as an ambiguous loss. The pandemic has added an additional ambiguous loss to your plate because we don't know how long this will last. We don't know the outcome or when it will resolve itself. And if you have a different set of circumstances than many people, your needs during the pandemic are going to look different, or the needs of your loved one. So there's a couple of great quotes in that article. It says, how do you adjust to an ever-changing situation where the new normal is indefinite and uncertain? And so we're living in this season where we can't even really find a new normal. I was so excited that DTS was going to open back up where I work in the fall. And I was like, I just gotta get my kids to school and I gotta start working, because then I'll have some normalcy. And one of the things I've discovered is that every week something different happens. And it's like we can't even kind of slip into those tracks of routine very well, because you guys have probably had this too. One week my childcare is sick. Another week we had a COVID exposure. This week we have a family member with COVID in another city. It's constant. The demands are constantly changing, and you're probably experiencing that too. So we can't even find a new normal yet. Also, ambiguous loss is difficult for a lot of times for Americans, because Americans, we tend to have this, or Westerners, we have this high value placed on being high achievers, having high capacity. You just work hard and you get through. And so ambiguous loss is more difficult for us because we can't just work harder. Part of it is because our surge capacity is completely depleted, and because we like to fix things, we conquer things, we fix. We're Americans. And so part of that is there's no foreseeable solution right now, and we can't fix it. And so it's increasing our angst, it's increasing our sense of loss. So if you feel completely out of sorts, that is entirely normative. If you don't, I need to talk to you afterwards, because I need to know what you're doing, because we need to package that and sell it. But everything is different and everything is ambiguous. So education has changed. If any of you have become the teacher for your children, work is different. Some of you may have been laid off, or you have to do your job wearing a mask, or little things. My husband is in sales, and he's like, okay, how do I forge relationships over Zoom? And I can't shake hands in the office. Little stupid stuff like that, but it's a big deal to figure out. Our customs and our ceremonies have changed, so that's a big one. And one of the things I want to tell you is that if your loss seems like it's not as profound, it is. Even the little things like missing graduations, missing birthday parties, especially missing rituals like funerals. God created us as meaning-making creatures, and when we miss out on those ceremonies where we ascribe meaning to things, and we get to be in community with other people and create meaning, it's painful for us. So I grew up in the Methodist Church, and have recently kind of gone back to my roots. And one of the things I love is the liturgical rhythms of the Methodist Church. And those rhythms are things that draw us to the Lord. And it's different if you're taking communion in your living room. Which that has different ecclesiological aspects to it that I won't get into, but it's different worshiping at home in your PJs. Again, it's a gift that we can gather, but it's different. So we're at a place where we've lost a lot. Also, one of the biggest parts with the pandemic is we're seeing that relationships that may have been fairly fragile to begin with, or maybe not so fragile, but just slightly fragile, the pandemic is pushing those over the edge because we're living in such a polarized time, as well as everybody has an opinion about whether or not you should wear a mask or you should not wear a mask. And we live in the United States, so we have the right to choose. And we also live in an individualistic culture. We don't live in a collectivistic culture. Whereas if we lived in a collectivistic culture, there might be more of a collective we're going to wear masks because that's what's good for everybody. Even if it's not what I need necessarily, I'm going to do it because I love my neighbor. We live in a different system. And so that's caused major divisions within relationships and families. And again, I would imagine I'm trying to think very specifically about those of us who are gathered tonight, how this would affect your family. It's probably extremely important that people think about you and your family when it comes to wearing masks. And so that may have hurt some of the relationships you have, or it may preclude you from participating in certain activities. So some of the things that we want to think about when we look at grief and loss is, what were our expectations going into something? So there's a great quote that says, the distance between expectation and reality is anger. The distance between expectation and reality is anger. And then I'm going to follow that up with another quote I love. I got to know my anger, and I discovered her real name was grief. So a lot of times anger is a secondary emotion, and there's something beneath that anger. And we need to feel the anger and give it space and acknowledge it, and then also be curious in a non-judgmental way to figure out what's beneath that anger. And a lot of times it is grief. And so we had expectations for 2020. I remember when we went into the sheltering in place, all of my classes went online, and I sat with a ton of students. The first week I was like, okay, we're gonna power through this, and I'm gonna lecture online, and we're just gonna power through. Again, lots of surge capacity in March. But I quickly realized that my students were drowning, as was I. And so I just was like, okay, we'll scrap all of that. I'll record my lectures and I'll post them for you guys to listen to. We're going to spend our time praying for each other and having praise and worship together during class time online. And one of the things I heard on repeat is, I'm so sad that I'm not going to get to participate in graduation in May, but that's so stupid because it's just graduation. I'm healthy, my family's healthy, it doesn't matter. And one of the things I continue to tell my students is, it does matter. It absolutely matters. There's a great line from David Kessler. He is an expert in the area of grief and loss, and he worked a lot with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and he wrote a book called Finding Meaning. And he has a great line in a podcast he did with Brene Brown in the spring, and he said, I have lost a child. He had lost his adult son, and he said, I've felt that loss, and I know that whatever someone else's loss is, their loss is just as valid as my loss, even if the world would say it's not. And so whatever your loss is, it is just as valid as someone else's. And sometimes we get stuck in this cycle where we try to push that down, and we're like, that's not a big deal. I shouldn't be upset about that. And really, what we need is to give ourselves compassion and gentleness and kindness, and allow ourselves to sit with that loss. And even though it may not be as significant in the moment, maybe as someone you're comparing yourself to, or someone you're conversing with in your family or friends or on Facebook, it is valid, and it's important to acknowledge that. So some of that is, start to think about what were your expectations for 2020 that were lost. Also, what were your expectations for your child or your parenting experience? So like I said at the beginning, sometimes this grief experience of the pandemic is revealing other losses that you may not have fully realized, or you may not have maybe allowed yourself the freedom and the space to grieve. And so in some ways, you may be face to face with the expectation that maybe you had before your child was born, and it's okay that you had that expectation, and it's okay to feel disappointed, and it's okay to feel sad, and it's okay to be angry, whatever the feeling is, or feelings. Usually they come with friends. lots of feelings come at the same time. But I think a lot of times we get stuck in what I would call a shame cycle of, I just need to be grateful that my kid is living. I just need to be grateful that I have a kid. My friends are struggling with infertility, or I need to be grateful that I have a job, or I need to da 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 da. And that shame keeps us stuck. I'm so sorry. I have a little visitor that just came in my office. Hey, bye bye. Sorry, another part of the pandemic. So shame is that felt sense that you're wrong and you're undeserving of love and connection because there's something that is defective in you. And usually we don't speak shame because we're afraid of what some people would think about us or say about us. And so what's most healing about shame is when you bring it into the light and you expose it to empathy. When you expose it to empathy, then it heals that shame. And so I'd encourage you to be able to sit with one another and maybe talk about those areas where you feel shame that may be surfacing. So I'm going to transition now to developmental needs. I apologize for my little visitor. That's another outgrowth of the pandemic, is not all the doors in my house lock, so that's difficult. Okay, so developmental needs related to grief. And what I'm going to say is, don't necessarily conceptualize yourself or your loved ones based on your chronological age. Conceptualize based on functional age and emotional age, or developmental age. So sometimes organically or genetically, someone's functional age is altered because of a difference. Sometimes trauma alters people's functional age. So as you conceptualize how this works out, think about where your loved ones would fall as well as where you would fall. So I would say if you've had a significant amount of trauma, usually what we see is that when trauma happens, we tend to sometimes get stuck emotionally in our development at the age at which it got really bad or the age at which it started. So you may find, or you may witness in a family member that they maybe function in a teenage developmental stage because of the trauma they've had, or the difference. Okay, so birth to 2 years old. This is the season of attachment development. So separation anxiety is super high during this time, and it's a huge concern. Also, conscious memories have not started to form yet during this age. They're not going to really start to solidify until about 4 or 5. They'll start about 3. So little bitty ones, they don't have a conscious memory of something, but they will have a felt sense of it. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he talks about how our conscious brain may not remember, but our body certainly does. So when we're talking about loss, we want to provide a lot of good physical touch across the lifespan, but definitely during this phase. There's a felt sense of need for safety and security as much as can be provided, as well as much predictability as possible. Also, children up to about 8 or 10, or really across the lifespan, if you're not doing very well, it's hard to remember details at times, need to be reminded of things, or may ask the same question 50,000 times, and they're just trying to make sense of the details in their brain, okay? Also, regardless of a person's age, they need to be involved in meaningful ceremonies that do occur. So whatever that is for your family, when we talk about death, because that's a part of this season, they need to be involved as much as they can in the death rituals. When we talk about worship rituals, children and adolescents still need to be involved in those. So keep that in mind. Also, we don't ever want to lie about what's happening. We just want to give developmentally appropriate information. Kids are super smart. They know all kinds of things that we don't think they know. We are pretty vocal with our older two. They're 10 and 8, and we talk about matters of social justice and social interest. And but I didn't realize. But we still try to protect them. We don't listen to a lot of news around them, and I didn't realize how worked up my middle one was until recently. I was tucking him in. I was like, "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" He was like, "I'm just so stressed." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, tell me more." And he's like, "I'm just really scared." And as he unpacked it, he said, "Mommy, I'm really scared about white supremacy and COVID-19." And I was like, oh, okay. I wasn't prepared for those answers. So they know stuff is going on. So you want to give them clear information. So when we're giving information about anything that's difficult or grief related, you don't have to give gory details, but you want to be clear and direct, and you don't want to use euphemisms. So when we go from 2 to 6 years old, you want to be very literal and concrete. That's how they interface with the world. That's how they interpret the world. When they look at death or difficult situations, it's always temporary and reversible. They need concrete, literal examples. 6 to 8, children begin to understand that death is irreversible and it's final, as well as certain circumstances are irreversible and they're final. And they're going to begin to be able to see things in a little more ambiguous way. So they can understand, we don't know when you're going to go back to school because we didn't know that in June, or we don't know when we're going to be able to see so and so. They can kind of start to live in that realm, but they have to be reminded. Remember, babe, we don't know when it's going to be safe to play with that friend or to see that family member. They just need to be reminded. From 8 to 12, this is when children and adolescents are really starting to be able to live in ambiguity and to think abstractly. And it's really a good idea at this season to start to really talk about, how does it feel to be in this place? How does it feel to live in this season of time? How does it feel to have this loss? Also, there is a natural pull that's happening. So from the adolescent years, and in the handout, I went up to 25, and I did that for adolescents because the brain doesn't finish fully forming until about the mid-20s. And so what we need to know about those individuals is they're not fully formed adults until mid-20s. If you have a loved one who has a cognitive difference, they may not reach that stage. So you just look at the guidelines for whatever stage that they're at. But we need to remember that part of this stage is identity development for adolescents, as well as pulling away. And that's been a really difficult thing when you can't leave or you can't be around people because of the danger of contracting this illness, that these individuals can't really thrive in their developmental needs. So being creative is really important. I also think it's important as we move into the adult years, there's not as much physical maturation and development going on, but we look at more at life tasks. So anytime you get out of step with your contemporaries or your cohort, the people that you're progressing with, that's going to make life more difficult. So if your contemporaries are all retired and vacationing and their children have launched and yours haven't, that's going to create a loss, and that's going to create an additional strain on you. So be extra kind and gentle with yourself. So in the early adult years, that is the season of establishing meaningful relationships, a family, and a career. So there's lots of responsibilities during this life stage, and there's lots of could be potential pile up because responsibilities will increase as you move more towards midlife. Also, when we look at the lifespan, we see that there's this balance between gains and losses. The earlier you are in the lifespan, the more gains you have as compared to losses. The more you move along the lifespan, your losses begin to outweigh your gains, and part of life is managing your losses. So as a person gets older, they will just need to learn how to manage those losses well, and to cope with the specific losses. So one of the things we're seeing with a lot of adults, especially aging adults, is loneliness, or single adults, that if you're by yourself, that's a big issue. And I'm gonna give some possible strategies for that. Also, another big aspect of midlife to older age 65 and above is continuing to find meaning. When we have meaning and purpose, we thrive. Without it, we tend to die. Like statistically, studies show that when we lose purpose, we die. So this would be important for anyone in your world who, maybe it's you, maybe it's a partner, maybe it's a loved one that you're caring for, that they need some sort of meaning. They found that in retirement villages or nursing homes, people do best when they have something to take care of, like a plant. or a pet. Or even they did this big study where they put a daycare in a nursing home facility, and it was amazing because it created this meaning for the residents to be able to care for these littles. So, okay, so let's go on to strategies for self-care. So this seems kind of trite, but I don't mean it to be trite. Studies are showing time and time again that gratitude is one of the most profound practices to increase your sense of well-being. So spending 5 minutes a day or 2 minutes a day saying, I'm grateful for these 3 things. And it doesn't have to be 3, it could be more, but this is just a really powerful tool to increase your sense of well-being. It's a great practice. We try to do it around our family, around our dinner table at night. We do highs, lows, and sometimes buffaloes, whatever was your random part of the day, or sometimes we'll do what are you grateful for? The next thing is there was this very interesting study done by a neuroscientist that said, just thinking about the top 10 best moments of your life, writing them down, and then spending 5 minutes a day reflecting upon those moments is super helpful in increasing your happiness. So what happens neurologically, every time that you remember something, your brain cells that fired or were activated when that memory was created, they run on that very same pathway. So every time you have a memory, it's essentially a living memory because it's doing the exact same thing neurologically it did when that memory was created. So all the emotions, all the feelings, all the good parts that happened when those top 10 memories were created, those you're intentionally causing your neurons to fire when you reflect upon those. Another one is mindful self-compassion. So there is a great resource by Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, and they have a webpage. I think I put the site in the notes for you. They have a course on mindful self-compassion, or you can work through their workbook. So one thing that I really want to touch on is what they call compassionate touch. And this is especially meaningful if you are living alone or living with someone who maybe isn't capable or has the ability to give you the hugs you need or the compassionate touch you need. That's a big thing right now because we're not seeing people. So things, they talk about others, but one thing that's really meaningful is just placing 1 or 2 hands over your heart and applying some pressure, and then saying some really gentle things to yourself of, I know it's been a hard day, or I see you, you've worked so hard, I'm proud of you. Another one, I can't do this because my arms don't stretch this way because I guess I have shoulder problems, but like putting your hands up here and kind of just applying pressure back here. I can do it with one hand. That's another part of compassionate touch. So anything like that is powerful. Another thing is a line by Dan Siegel. He's a psychiatrist in California, and he has this saying that says, name it to tame it, feel it to heal it. So when we want to bring control over our emotions, we want to name them, and then we want to feel it. And emotions are like waves. They will crest and then they will fall. I've heard some people say that usually I think they last about 90 seconds, but actually if you can make it through the first 8 seconds of an emotion, you can make it through the rest of the time. So sometimes I sing the song Amarillo by Morning in my head. Is it I'll be gunning for 8 when they pull that gate? I don't know. That's what I think about. Another one, vital needs. This stems out of a activity I did, or a program I did called Naturally Slim. It's about eating mindfully, and they talk about identifying what you need to be okay. And needs are God-given parts of your humanity. I read a book this summer called Liturgy of the Ordinary, and they talk about how us being needy and having to sleep and having to brush our teeth or brush our hair always points us back to the cross and our need for a savior. And God made us that way. And so identifying what your needs are. And then finally, I'll say this and I'll open it up for questions. Your losses, whatever they are just as valid as someone else's. Your pain is just as valid. There is not a loss that is too small. You need to be seen. You need to know that you matter and your loss matters. And so I want to say that to you. And I want to encourage you to say that to each other and to say it to yourself. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andi. Y'all, if you have a question, I'm gonna take us off Spotlight and go to Gallery View. And if you have a question, if you'll just raise your hand and I'll just call on you and you can take yourself off mute and we can go forward like that. Anybody? Any questions? You covered a lot of material for it, and that was really, it was so comprehensive and really wonderful. I really liked when you shared with us that one of the tasks of adulthood is learning to manage your losses well. I found that very striking. So yeah, just thank you for sharing that, because I have seen in myself as losses are starting to come a little bit more, and it was an outside source like validate that and say, yep, that's something that's in adulthood.
Well, and I appreciated kind of what you shared about kind of experiencing losses in a different way during this pandemic. Because I have a 21-year-old son with disabilities, and during this pandemic, some of those early feelings I had, have kind of resurfaced. And initially I thought, well, I should be over that. He's 21 and, I've already worked through that, God, why am I having to deal with it again or whatever? And so just some of your explanation of that was just very, very comforting, to know that this, it kind of comes up again and again, and with different stages and different situations, and this pandemic just has, brought it up again, so thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Melanie.
Nancy, go ahead.
I was intrigued by the comment about compassionate touch. And I feel like so much of this loss that we have during this time is because of our lack of ability to touch. I mean, some of us are just touchers, and it's just devastating. And some of us aren't, and they're wondering what's the big deal. But I'm trying to think of some way to substitute touch. How can we find another outlet for that same thing? Those of us who are huggers and touchers, and it's a really tough time for the touchy-feely people. I mean, doubly so.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Nancy, you bring up a great point. And I will say I'm not a big toucher, and I have felt just at a loss. And so I can imagine for people that are more demonstrative with touch, it's a huge need and hole. So in therapeutic practice, I keep a lot of like plush, comforting objects like stuffed animals and fuzzy blankets in my practice, even for adults. And so one of the things that I'll see is adults will pull it up and hold it tight. And I've realized that now during the pandemic, that's so important. It's still not the same, but it's one more outlet. There is, and this is my favorite one. I discovered it because of my daughter. There's these things called Squishamallows, and you can buy them. Liz knows exactly what they are. You can buy them at Costco, and they come out with new ones every 6 weeks, I've discovered, because we have like 18. But they're huge, and they're made of this weird material that is just really nice. So that's a good way. Kristen Neff and Chris Germer, they give other recommendations for compassionate touch, where you, hand over your heart, giving yourself a hug, just that squeezing. I have a good friend that's a play therapist that I saw at church the other day, and she said, I read in a study that if you if you both turn your face the other way and you wear a mask, you could give each other a hug. And so there's some of that research that's saying that's possible. I would even think about some of the, I don't know if this has been studied, but like having someone wrap their arms around you and they're behind you, that maybe you're not facing each other, or maybe you put a jacket between the two of you, something that covers your face but gives you that touch, because I mean, we were created for that. It is one of the number one ways that we build attachment and connection. And without it, we see that infants literally will die after a season if they're not touched. Like, they die. And so we need it, all of us.
Dr. Andi, thank you. I am seeing so much job loss within personal situations and friend situations and just in general. Clearly, it sounds like the stages of grief are going to be the same, but anything specific you have for us to help friends who are losing a job?
Yeah. So anytime someone is in grief and loss, the most important thing you can do is practice the ministry of presence. So there's probably not a whole lot that you can do to fix it, unless you might have some connections, but being present with them in their pain and not shying away from that pain. So there's a lot of studies that show that trust is built on little moments where you show up in the hard seasons, but they're not necessarily major times. So continuing to check in on them on a regular basis. Hey, I've been thinking about you. How you doing? And just like staying the course with them as much as you can. I know that many times it's hard when I train counselors to sit with people in grief, is I have to remind them to be very aware of their need to fix something and to manage that in a way that they don't say something to help themselves feel better when they feel so helpless in the face of their friend's loss. So I think just being present and managing the need to have to say something is really powerful.
I think I also heard you reference Kubler-Ross. Is it still a good reference? I'm curious.
She is a good reference if her stages are understood as the way she wrote them. So she wrote them as stages of dying, and that they're not cyclical, and they're not linear, and not everybody goes through them. And knowing that she didn't do a lot of empirical research on them, but knowing they're about the dying process and they're not linear. Like, you're not going to check those off the box and then like, oh, I got to acceptance, I'm good. So yeah, there's the book by David Kessler. He worked with her a lot and wrote several books with her. And so he petitioned her family to write the book Finding Meaning, and he's adding that as a 6th stage. And so he really unpacks a lot of it in his book, and it's really good.
Thank you.
Any other questions, y'all? All right. Well, Dr. Andi, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take us off recording.